a lot of times, especially the more junior roles, you have to, like, a lot of firms are doing these like mock cold call interviews where they're really testing how good you are at sales, picking up the phone and calling a CEO, pitching the firm. You don't have any exposure to that in investment banking. So I think a lot of candidates are surprised.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
As a former banker, investor, founder, product manager to his current position as the founder of Growth Equity Interview Guide, Mike has witnessed firsthand what it takes to land and succeed in a growth equity position. Having recruited from Deutsche Bank to General Atlantic, Mike joins us today to discuss founding Growth Equity Interview Guide in 2017 and what it takes to recruit successfully in growth and venture capital. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Laura. Hey, Will. Nice to be on. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And so you probably have one of the more diverse backgrounds of any guest that we've brought on. So how did your former roles lead you to start Growth Equity Guide?
So you mentioned I sort of started as a Wall Street guy, did investment banking, moved on, got my dream job at a fund called General Atlantic, which is a growth equity fund. And since then, I've gone into tech. I did a long stretch at Airbnb, which was a portfolio company of General Atlantic. And now I'm an entrepreneur. But if you go back to my days as an investor at General Atlantic, I sort of say sometimes that I like caught the growth equity bug. You're investing in these amazing, inspiring companies that are growing quickly. Everything's working. They're changing the world. And all I want to do is jump into these companies and help them build, grow, succeed, own something, build something, etc. And I actually found a lot of my classmates at General Atlantic and other friends I have in the industry, a lot of people investing in growth catch that bug, certainly VC as well. Just really inspiring to be around. And so in any case, that's why I left. And I went to a portfolio company that General Atlantic had invested in, which was really exciting. It was Airbnb. So I did a long stretch there. And anyway, to wrap this up, I always knew that I wanted to try my hand at starting a company. So Airbnb was great learning for that. I started coaching people on how to get into growth investing on the side years ago. So now I'm doing that full time, and that's where we are today.
Doing it full time, it must have been a passion of yours. It sounds like you're already doing this on the side. Is it because you saw the difficulties of recruiting and the lack of resources?
There are so many more resources out there now than, for example, when me, the old guy here, when I went through it. There's so much out there now. I remember being so excited when I found there was a hard copy of private equity interview questions that I like stumbled upon from an analyst at Deutsche Bank. He happened to have it, and I like made a photocopy of it. This is like in the Stone Age. The thought just didn't even occur to anyone to go online, Google it, and see what's out there, because there wasn't anything out there. So now there's a lot more out there, but there is still not a lot out there around growth investing in particular. And this comes also at a time when growth investing has never been more relevant. This is where a lot of the returns are happening. Everyone's raising a growth fund. Growth equity is now a thing that people talk about. When I was at General Atlantic, we were all kind of looking at each other being, is this like a thing, or is this just like a marketing term that GA uses? Or does anyone know what growth equity is? Well, now it's like a real thing. So that's one. And two, the other thing is, yes, helping people get into growth equity, private equity, it may not be curing cancer, but it is really meaningful when you can help someone who really, really wants it land their dream job. I've had the pleasure of doing that with so many clients. I remember when I landed my job at GA and got a couple other offers, it felt so life-changing, really changed my trajectory, and it changes these folks too. So that is very inspiring and fun to play a part in for other people. So that's why I'm doing it now.
I completely agree. And some of the other interview platforms out there are broader platforms, probably catered towards just the general finance ecosystem. I'm trying to break into growth equity. Like, why should Laura choose Growth Equity Guide over some of the other platforms like a Wall Street Prep or a Wall Street Oasis, for example?
This kind of goes back to one of the reasons why I started it, which is no one is focusing on the growth stage. There's some stuff out there for venture, although hiring and venture tends to be every fund is pretty different and has a different process. There's a lot of networking too, for sure. So venture's the wild, wild west. And then private equity, there's a lot of stuff. Buyout, there's a lot of resources. There's tons of LBO models out there. No one is specifically thinking and talking about how should you think as a growth investor? What are the levers that you should be thinking about when you look at deals? How does the modeling change? Is it an LBO? Is it an LBO with some other stuff? Do I even need to know modeling and growth? There's so little out there and the platform that I'm making or have made is kind of the only one out there that's truly dedicated to this space. I've thought about adding other resources for other related jobs, but maybe I will in the future. But even the ones that have a lot of different verticals, private equity, investment banking, no one has dedicated verticals to growth stage.
And you mentioned briefly, I think it's funny that back when you were at General Atlantic, that you almost thought of the growth equity term as a marketing ploy. And obviously now it's clearly a class of investing that exists. And there are other growth equity focused firms. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think the growth equity landscape has changed since you've been at GI.
For sure. It's changed a lot. So when I was investing in growth equity at GA, to be honest, yeah, it was kind of an immature asset class. It was, the best way to describe it is, we do pre-IPO rounds. We're a late stage venture. It was immature. No one really knew what it was. And it was like, hey, is this a marketing term? Now, fast forward to today, growth equity is a huge asset class. It's driving a ton of returns. And you think about how the world's changed over the last 10 years. Now, I mean, everything's so tech enabled. Software is eating or has eaten the world. And also, companies aren't going public until much, much, much later. And so it's created this opportunity, that plus 0% interest rates forever till recently, where there's now a lot of returns and value being created kind of after you find product market fit, but before you go public, which is now pushed out a lot. And so as a result, now it's not just General Atlantic, it's KKR, it's Blackstone, it's big mega funds, private equity funds, plus venture capital funds like Sequoia has a huge growth fund, NEA, Capital G, or Google's kind of venture fund now, they have a growth fund. And then you've also got hedge funds coming in. So basically the picture is now much bigger asset class. People who were doing it before, like GA and others, are now way bigger than they were previously, but also a lot of other funds have now, or firms have raised funds within the growth space. So everyone's kind of doing it. And all of this has actually made the interview picture much more complicated for candidates because you interview at Blackstone's growth fund, the odds are it's going to be much more likely that you have an LBO model or you need to know LBO modeling amongst other things if you interview there because they're an LBO buyout shop traditionally versus if you're interviewing at Sequoia's growth fund, the odds are much lower that you're going to need to know how to build a full-scale LBO model because they just test different things and they have different firm DNA, but everyone's kind of doing this thing called growth stage investing. So a lot more firms, a lot more money, and a lot harder for candidates to know what to prepare as they're trying to break in.
And how have you seen trends specifically on the recruiting side change? It seems like a lot of funds are recruiting analysts nowadays. How has the growth equity recruiting landscape changed?
Yeah, you teed it up. That's been a big change. The fact that analysts are now getting hired out of undergrad. And that's not just the biggest funds anymore. That had kind of started happening years ago at some of the bigger funds and is still happening there. But now, I mean, a lot of funds view sourcing, outbound sales, which is what a lot of analysts kind of focus on, as like a core competency far before they're reach the stage of mega fund. A lot more roles at the analyst level to kind of do sourcing, find companies, be the front lines to pitch the firm. That's changed a lot. Of course, the terrible but inevitable sort of on cycle recruiting madness in the US recruiting scene, that's gotten even crazier. And it's the slow march of it getting earlier and earlier in a candidate's career continues. So now investment banking analysts, I believe last year the on cycle stuff started in September of your first year in an investment banking program. You're literally on the job for a couple months. When I was going through it, people were saying how crazy it was that it happened 9 months into the job. I got my job at GA in April of my first year. So anyway, that's gotten crazier and earlier and earlier.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how the interview prep and the requirements that funds or skills rather that funds are looking for have changed as the interviews have gotten earlier and people's careers and they've started to look for analysts instead of associates. What advice would you have for someone who's a junior in college that's looking to get into growth equity, and kind of what timeline should they expect?
If you were in college, I'll call it the best way, but the most common way, there's no right way or wrong way. The most common way, the highest probability way of getting into growth investing is still going to investment banking for 2 years, being top bucket analyst, top analyst in your class, top analyst in your group, and then really preparing, learning how to do modeling, getting an awesome reputation, and doing recruiting like we just talked about, buy side recruiting during that program. That is still the tried and true way. But one thing that pops up related to your question is a lot of these roles in the growth stage, I think a lot of banking folks, despite what I just said, banking and consulting folks are surprised when they get into the job, but also in interviews, that the job is much more than what they've spent 2 years learning in investment banking. And so specifically, there are skills like coming up with a thesis about a market that you like, right? What's a thesis about a market? Why is that market interesting? Why is it likely to produce investments? Why should a firm spend time there? How do you find 4 privately held prospects that are interesting, that fit our criteria? Why are they interesting? Those are things tangentially related to what you learn in investment banking, but you aren't doing that in investment banking. So that's a surprise. The other thing is a lot of times, especially the more junior roles, you have to, like a lot of firms are doing these like mock cold call interviews where they're really testing how good you are at sales, picking up the phone and calling a CEO, pitching the firm. You don't have any exposure to that in investment banking. So I think a lot of candidates are surprised. That can pop up during interviews. It like pops up on the job. Those parts are your job once you get in the firm. I would say investment banking is still the best path in. Of course, if you can get an analyst role and skip investment banking and you want to do that, that's great. But going into investment banking, probably still the best path. And it is a tough job and interview to prepare for because investment banking isn't quite as aligned as with growth investing as it might be with like buyout investing, let's say.
And you've mentioned a couple of the potential interview questions and interview topics. Analyzing and coming up with different theses on subsectors is certainly one that I think comes up a lot. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what candidates could potentially do outside of their investment banking job and outside of specific interview prep in order to differentiate themselves. Naturally, you have a pool of candidates that are of the highest quality that are interested in growth equity. Oftentimes difficult to really produce a resume or a skill set or experience that is differentiated. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you can do to kind of really set yourself apart.
We could spend a lot of time on this. I was actually just adding a module to my course related to this. What a lot of candidates don't spend enough time on, and I'm confident that even after I say this, they may not believe me because they're skeptical. But candidates are always concerned about doing the technicals, doing the modeling. That's very tangible. Is the model right? Is it not? Et cetera. It's very clear. So candidates want to spend a lot of time on technicals. And of course, I have a course that helps them learn all that stuff. So on the one hand, I think that's great and it's important. That does need to be right. But what they don't spend enough time on is really thinking creatively and deeply about their candidacy's overall story. And what I mean by that is, why should the fund pick you? If you are a product, why should the firm buy you and not the other 49 products on the shelf? So you sort of think about that and you're like, okay, what are the possible answers to that? It's like, do you solve a problem for them? Are you a sector expert on a specific industry that they really want to go deeper on? Do you have such amazing qualifications that you truly are better than 50 other people? I've got a whole framework that goes into this, but the summary is probably the best ways to stand out are across 4 different dimensions. One is, it's a weird word. I think I made it up. I call it exceptionalness. Imagine the partner who's hiring you at a dinner party the night after they give you an offer, and that partner is like, oh, talking to their friends at this interview. You wouldn't imagine how amazing the kids are these days that we're bringing into this fund. We just hired this person who cured cancer in their research in undergrad and is now doing finance. Or think about how impressive the kids are these days. What will they say about you to brag on you? So those are things, obviously your GPA, your test scores. Did you win awards in undergrad? Were you top bucket? Are you the first person in your family to go to college? What is the story you're telling them on how amazing and exceptional you are? That's one. But really quickly, the other categories are passion for finance. Are you literally doing this job on nights and weekends outside of your already demanding job? Even if they don't hire you, would you be doing this job on your own?
Like a podcast.
Yeah. Actually, I had a coaching candidate who landed an amazing job. She's the best example of this. So think about this. She went to a good school, and at that school, she went on a trip she was undergrad. She went on a school trip to, I forget what country in Africa. I think it was Nigeria, some country in Africa. Let's call it Nigeria. She goes on this trip and it's unrelated to finance, but she was like, hey, I'm really interested in startups and investing. And so basically, she found 100 startups in Nigeria and cold emailed those founders and set up 10 meetings on her 2 free days while she was there, because she was interested in learning about investing and meeting with founders and stuff. She is doing the job even though she doesn't have the job already. That is the vibe that you want to show them.
That's a good point. And just one quick thing that I would add, because I do have some experience interviewing growth equity candidates, is because there is a sourcing element to it and you want to show that you really enjoy the job outside of it being a job. It's great to get a sense of candidates or demonstrate as a candidate what motivates you to do the job. Are you interested in it because you get a high salary, or is it because you genuinely enjoy learning about startups and you genuinely enjoy learning about this subsector of technology you think is going to make a difference?
I love that. Yeah. I tell candidates, think about, like, basically after your interviews, your interviewers are going to go back in a room somewhere with their colleagues and they're going to talk about all the candidates who they interviewed. And basically, they're going to go one by one and they're going to come to you, and your interviewer is going to give 3 sentences on why they should hire you if they want to hire you. What are those 3 sentences going to be? How do you actually differentiate yourself? And hint, the answer can't be, oh, this is a smart young person who's going to work hard.
It's like table stakes at this point. Because like if you don't have that work rate, then it's probably just not the right opportunity for you.
That's exactly right. And for better or worse, it's gotten that competitive where this is arguably like the hardest job in the world to get. And so you got to do a lot of things to differentiate. I'm realizing I left off two other ways to differentiate. I won't spend a ton of time on them, but just to round out the framework, it's showing that you have incredible aptitude to learn. I call it being a super learner. This is especially important for like younger candidates, but you want to show, hey, this person is going to pick this up extremely quickly. They were a physics major. They were summa cum laude in physics, and now they're like a star banker. So of course they're going to figure out it. They're super into investing. Of course they're going to figure it out, and they're going to be great. So showing that you can pick things up quickly, you do hard things, you do them well. And then lastly, having sales or sort of entrepreneurial experience shows that, hey, we can put this person on cold calling, or we can put them in front of CEOs and they can take failure. They're not going to fall apart. They can also compose themselves and show well in front of management teams. Those are the other two things that I would encourage candidates to look for. And I guess I keep plugging my course, but in the course, I go through there's a bunch of different ways that you aren't thinking of that maybe you've done already, but if you haven't done them, there might still be time to do these things to show that you have those attributes to improve your candidacy.
One could argue that you could show ambition or work rate through networking. That might help you with a leg up, just reaching out and talking to people at the firm. How important is that in growth equity? Because I think, as you mentioned earlier, venture is the wild, wild west, and networking is really important. But is growth on that same wavelength?
The answer is it depends. For some firms, simply networking would ladder up to showing that you're super passionate about this job. I put that in the passionate for finance bucket, and I do think it can help with a lot of firms. It helps more the younger you are, the more you're in analyst recruiting, but honestly, it can really help for associate and VP recruiting too. I was just working with someone who landed a job at like a tier 1A, truly great growth fund, and he got it a lot through networking. He got a lot of opportunities through networking, and ultimately the job that he got was also from networking. So it's easy to dismiss because it can really take a lot of time. It's also not going to be a high hit rate thing. You're not going to network with 10 funds and get 5 offers. In reality, you're going to have to send cold emails and network with honestly 100 funds, and maybe that'll turn into 20 conversations, and maybe one of those will result in an offer. But if you are committed, it can be very helpful still, even today.
If you think about the progression of interviews at a growth equity fund, on average, how many are there typically? And can you just break out 2 behavioral, 2 technical, maybe 1 modeling, the structure?
So there's an overall structure which most processes adhere to, but then there's also a lot of variation within firms. Everything I say could change and could be a little different. But in general, you'll have kind of an initial interview that tends to be more resume based. Your interviewer is probably going to be a junior investment professional. They want to get to know you a bit. They might ask you 1 or 2 technical questions. So it's not going to be purely behavioral or resume based, but they tend to focus in those areas. I would say in your first interview, you're likely to get a question like, tell me about a stock that you think is interesting, or tell me about a space or a market that you really like, testing whether or not you've done your homework. But they may not go into a ton of detail in your first interview. This is just assessing, is this person serious or well prepared? And then next, you'll probably have 1 or 2 other interviews with other members of the team. And honestly, this is where things go all over the place. It'll be a mix of behavioral, investing, technical, deal questions, mini case studies, verbally, paper LBOs, stuff like that. But then eventually there'll typically be a super day where you'll meet with 5 or 6 people at a fund. Maybe some of them are partners, principal level people, VPs, certainly. And either before or after that, often you'll get a case study, which will involve modeling or looking at a market or looking at an investment. These are what I help a lot of candidates kind of prep for, because the case studies can be so varied. We can talk about which ones are kind of most common. Typically, you'll have a take home or an in-person case study before or after the super day where you're meeting with more senior folks as well. To summarize, typically you'll meet with 8 people I don't know, 6 to 8 people. Depends on how big the fund is. If it's a smaller fund, maybe fewer people than that. Really big fund, you'll meet with 5 to 8 people, and it'll progressively, the people will become more and more senior who you talk to.
That makes sense. And then within the case, what are the most important aspects of that assessment? If you could give like a specific example that would be helpful for the listeners.
There's a lot of different kinds of cases you can get. Let's break it down into the 2 most common. So one is a modeling test, and it's typically couched as an investment recommendation. So they'll give you a filing or like a pack of information on a company, and they'll say, hey, build a model and tell us whether or not you invest in this company. That's one class of case study. The other class of case study, which a lot of funds are doing, is tell us about a market that you like. Here's 5 different markets. Tell us which one you think is most attractive, which one should we be spending time in, and find some prospects within this space. 2 very different things. One's very modeling heavy, one's very sourcing and investment thinking heavy.
That's helpful. And one thing I've noticed, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree with this, is like typically the growth equity funds that are just growth equity without a buyout strategy, I've noticed those firms see a little bit less technical in terms of whether the case or like a separate modeling versus the funds that have a private equity strategy. We'll give HIG as an example with a growth strategy attached to it. I've seen those tend to be more technical. And I don't know if that's because their roots are in buyouts and then they're also leveraging a growth equity strategy as a newer strategy. But that's kind of what I found in my interview process.
I think that's largely right. That's what I was trying to say before, is it really kind of depends on the roots of the firm, how they approach diligence. But I can say this without judgment, but some funds who come from a private equity background, let's say Blackstone, their diligence process in private equity is so exacting and so thorough, and they bring a lot of that rigor to the growth stage. Blackstone's not going to do super easy diligence. And so they're probably going to care a lot about modeling and technical modeling and how to diligence a company. And so that's going to show up in their case study. Whereas a more venture style firm, it might be more about market assessment, founder quality, stuff like that. And so they might test a little less rigorously around modeling, but it really depends. One last thing, there's also a class of case study that's sort of like thinking about a business. They'll give you, hey, here's a portfolio company, write all the pros and cons. What are the things that you like? What are the things you don't like? What would you be worried about? Would you invest in this company? And it's less around building a model and it's more around show us how you think like an investor. I've been thinking about how I can make an offering that's kind of like helps folks gain that thinking and those reps around how to think like an investor, because that can come up a lot as well, not just in growth, that's also other kinds of investing.
I even had case studies where it's looking at a 20 to 30 pitch deck and then walking through and how you think about like different parts of the business. And then there's metrics tied in that as well. And then coming up with some next steps or a decision versus just on the pitch deck.
I love that. Yeah, and really what they're trying to do is they're trying to assess your instincts. Is this person thinking like an investor? Do they understand where risks are? What could go right? What could go wrong with this company? If you're looking at, if you do that exercise with a fund and you're going through a 10K or deck for, let's say, a D2C consumer business, is it occurring to you that the biggest risk here is thinking about marketing costs and customer acquisition? Or do those words not even like occur to you and you kind of get swept up in the vision for the products that they're launching and the brand and stuff, and you don't even think about the other sort of obvious thing that pro investors are thinking about? So anyway, those are instincts that are hard to teach. I've got a bunch of ideas about how I could help candidates there, but that is challenging. And I'd say the more you prep the other areas, often you'll start to develop instincts in this area as well.
And so we have two questions for you to close out the episode. And the first one is, what motivates you to work hard?
Oh. Doesn't it all just boil down to like, we just want to be loved? Sorry to get a little next level, but I want to build stuff. I want to build a meaningful company. I want to help people. And why am I doing all of that? I don't know. I think it's maybe to be loved. I'm not sure. It's funny. You caught me on this question. I'm part of this executive coaching group, and we were talking the other day about how almost everything ladders up to three fundamental desires. It's to be loved by others, to be secure, and have control. Feel like you have control of your life.
And then what's a piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
There's maybe a lot of ways I could answer that, but one thing that comes up for me right now, for whatever reason, is I see this in candidates a lot, and this was the case for me, that candidates really put on a pedestal these super name brand funds, and they think to some extent that if they don't get in super early in their career, it's never going to happen for them, and they'll never go to tier one fund. To some extent, I totally understand that thinking. And I was also thinking similarly, but having had now more years on this earth and seen a lot of careers evolve, what I've seen is focusing too much on brand is a very short term optimization. And oftentimes candidates want to, they're in this mode early in their career around doing things that expand their options in their career, not contract them. And going to a strong brand for a fund, that really expands the options. But at some point in your career, you actually need to start, I say need to, in my world, at some point in your career, you start making decisions that narrow your options, right? And so it's not all about keeping your options open, I guess is what I'm saying. If all you're doing is going to the best name brand fund that you can go to, you might sacrifice on, hey, is this the best place for me to thrive? Is this the kind of place that I could legitimately work for 10 years and build a great career over, 10, 20-year time frame for these people I want to work with? Instead, it's, I got to go to Blackstone for 2 years, and then I got to go to this business school, and then I got to go to Blackstone again. And it's like at some point, it's okay and actually probably desirable, I think, to start narrowing your options. Go to the fund that's smaller, where you can really come in and impact the outcome, help build the fund. I think that's super cool. And you don't always have to go to the top funds. In summary, one, people would have not optimized for decisions that keep my options open, because oftentimes later on in your career, you can do those things anyway. You don't have to do them right away. But two, I would give myself permission to optimize for the here and now and trust that things will work out, rather than always optimizing for going to the best fund or the best firm or the best brand or whatever. Because sometimes that doesn't even help you in the long run.
Very good advice. And I think this whole episode has been filled with great advice for younger people looking to break into the space. And so Laura and I are very appreciative of your time. Thanks for coming on, and I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys. Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me.